Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk episode with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello, Lisa. How are you doing today?
Oh, we're doing pretty good. I'm surrounded in beautiful flowers, so I'm pretty happy right now. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just looking forward to the fall, which is my favorite season. So I'm very good. I get really excited at this time of year.
I'm feeling that way too. And actually, I saw some leaves falling yesterday and I thought, oh, how nice is that? So, what's on our agenda today?
Well, we're going to be continuing today with that troubleshooting sort of theme that we started with last week's episode. But today we're going to be talking about some germination issues with cool flower transplants. So we'll just be covering some common things like nothing is sprouting, or you're having an issue with one particular seed not sprouting, or the most common question of all, the struggle with surface sown seeds. So we'll be covering some of those questions today.
Great, let's get to it.
Okay, so we're going to start with one of the most common questions we hear, and it's I'm starting a variety of different seeds and nothing seems to be sprouting. What could the problem be? And the first thing we always tell people when we hear this is if you're experiencing widespread germination issues across all the different types of seeds you're trying to start, it's most likely indicative of some sort of environmental problem.
Yes, when you have multiple seed varieties that are not sprouting, then the common denominator there is the environment. And I mean, normally it's temperature related, whether that's too hot on a heat mat, not warm enough on a heat mat, or the air temperature is too hot, which is really a frequent problem this time of the year. My grow room is set up that it's air conditioned so that I can kind of control the air temperature. But usually when you have multiple types of seeds not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's pretty much an environmental issue.
And we see this a lot from people at this time of year starting their fall cool flower transplants when they're trying to start their seeds outdoors in a greenhouse or in a potting shed or something like that. It's a real struggle for people in that situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Or on a carport or something like
Right.
that. And in a garage is a classic, right? And it's,
Yes.
like as I mentioned, it is really hot here right now. And I mean, it would be super steamy in an unconditioned area. And I think that's one of the things I just want to mention to people that really I love and drew me to soil blocking in the beginning because I did do all of my seed starting in my little bungalow house when I first started 27 years ago. Soil blocking is so space savvy. You could tuck it away in a spare bedroom or in a closet, maybe, or even on top of your dryer. In that space, you can really support a lot of seedlings so that you can get them indoors in an air conditioned space if you don't have access to that, because if there's really nothing to do to overcome the incorrect temperature. So that is a really big problem.
Yeah. And something else I've suggested to people too is at a minimum, you could attempt to germinate the seeds indoors, like you just described, Lisa, and then you could try moving them out. The temperature conditions will likely still be a bit warm out there, but you might have better luck at least getting them to
Yeah.
germinate if you're not experiencing anything like that now. So, Lisa, can you just review the ideal temperature conditions for cool flowers and the heat mat setup that we typically recommend?
Sure. So, what I have found to be the optimal air temperature is 65 to 70 degrees. And when you use a seedling heat mat like we do, that has a built in thermostat, and that thermostat warms the heat mat 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the air temperature. So, if you think about that, so if your room is 65, that means that the heat mat is going to warm up to 80 degrees, say. So if you had that heat mat in a warmer space, 80 degrees, that mat's going to be like 95 degrees. And that will easily explain why your cool season seeds are not sprouting, right? So your air temperature of 65 to 70 degrees, not only for the heat mat situation, but that's also once they sprout, they tend to grow vegetatively on the top, really great at that temperature. So we know that our room gets a little bit warmer. I mean, if it gets 75 degrees in there, if it gets 70 degrees, let's just say, that's really going to heat it up to 85 to 90 degrees. Well, that's a little too warm for cool flowers. So we use cookie cooling racks, and we just place those racks on the seedling heat mat, and that creates about an inch space between the mat and the bottom of your tray. You place the tray on the cookie cooling rack, and that little air space still produces or allows warm air to rise to the bottom of those trays, but it's not hot. And that really revolutionized our seed starting for cool season hardy annuals. And so that's how we cool the mat down a little bit, because they do need, the lion's share of them need a consistent warm conditions to sprout and break dormancy.
Right. So ideally, the environment would be 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit in terms of air temperature. And then you'd want to put your trays on a cookie cooling rack that is sitting on a heat mat. And that often will give you the ideal conditions. If it is significantly warmer than that in the space you're trying to start in, you may need to try eliminating the heat mat altogether if you really are not experiencing germination.
Yep.
Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're in a much cooler space, you might actually need to put your trays directly on the heat mat. So it all kind of just depends on your conditions where you're starting these seeds.
Yeah, if you're just not having any germination, you might just place the trays over on a shelf without the heat mat. I mean, what do you have to lose at this point? And because they have been warmed up, which tells them to break dormancy, but it's just too hot for them to sprout, just setting them over on a shelf just in fact may do that. And in fact, I do that with Ami Magus and Daucus. We put them on the seedling heat mat for about 24 to 36 hours. And then we just set them over on a shelf. And lo and behold, about 7 days later, the entire tray has sprouted. It's pretty amazing how that works.
Yeah. And another potential side effect of these too warm conditions that people often experience at this time of year is that your soil blocks, for example, they may really be drying out during the day and not staying moist enough to get good germination.
Yeah, and because so many of the seeds that we sow are surface sown, they need light to germinate. It's really easy to get them dried out. And so we tend to use wide weave burlap, and that allows the big holes on wide weave burlap allow air circulation, but yet it retains moisture. And that just helps to aid germination. And so you can also, a lot of people use domes or they lay saran wrap right on top of them. The problem that we have experienced and experienced with those is it's really easy to encourage diseases like funguses, like dampening off issues in those conditions because they retain so much moisture. They just need to be monitored really closely. They work, but you just have to monitor them really closely. And I am a confessed once a day visitor to my grow area. I go in the morning, tend to all my seedlings, water everybody, move them if they need to be moved, whatever. And then they don't see me again till the next morning. And using plastic toppers of any type is not very, that you can't really do that.
So if you are having issues with multiple different types of seeds, multiple different varieties, check your temperature conditions, try to match them to what we've described, adjust your heat mat setup, and then also make sure that you're not over or under watering, depending on if your temperatures are much cooler or warmer than what we're describing. And we always recommend covering with something like Lisa mentioned, like wide weave burlap to help retain some moisture at the soil surface, because if the seeds don't stay moist, they will not germinate well for you.
Yes.
I also wanted to mention that putting your cool flower seeds in the freezer for a couple of weeks prior to sowing can often help to improve germination rates, but there is a protocol involving desiccant packs that you should follow when doing that to make sure you don't inadvertently damage your seeds in the process. And we won't be going into that today, but you might want to check out episodes 49 and 11 for some tips about freezing your cool flower seeds and how to do that properly without damaging them.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to move on to a little bit of the opposite of what we just talked about. I'm having germination issues with just one type of seed. How can I troubleshoot what's going wrong? What would you recommend telling them to help troubleshoot what they may have done wrong or what could be causing them to not germinate when everything else is germinating just fine?
Sure. My first step would be to review the seed sowing instructions, because we were just talking about this earlier today. I love that here on the farm now, all the seeds that we start here to grow in our garden for plants, come from the warehouse. I mean, the same place people, when they're purchasing seeds, my seed are coming from the same bins that your seeds are coming from. And what that does is it has the sowing instructions right on the packet, because I don't remember which seeds get covered and which ones don't, and who needs this or that. And I do believe, I mean, well, we figured it out from talking to people. People are either of the school where they cover all their seeds or they don't cover any of them. They think they're all one way or another. And that, in fact, is not really true. So that would be my first step, is to actually go back and see what the seed needed. And then did I actually do that?
Can I just add on to that, Lisa? I just wanted to say to also try to check the anticipated number of days to germinate, because
Yes.
it could be that that particular seed just takes longer. Some seeds are really fast and they'll pop up within a few days. Some might take a couple weeks. So make sure you've gotten that right. And I also want to say in regards to that, that different varieties, even of the same seed type, can take different times to germinate. So you might say, well, all my other Snapdragons germinated just fine. I'm just waiting on this one variety. Well, it could just be that that variety takes a little longer.
You know, Elaine, I learned that lesson with tomatoes years ago, back when we were growing a lot of vegetables, and we grew a lot of different types of tomatoes. And I had sown some Roma tomatoes along with all of our others that we were growing, and they just didn't germinate. And I literally said, I mean, well, I guess that seed was a dud, I mean, what's the deal with that? And I literally set the tray off to the side, because it was, we were overcome all the time back then. Just set it over to the side, and lo and behold, like a week or two later, all of a sudden the Roma tray is 100% germinated. So all the other tomatoes germinated in 5 to 7 days, not those Romas that we were growing. So that's a great point. And it can be within the same family.
Yes. Okay, so you were saying to go back to the seed packet, confirm you've either surface sown it or you've pushed it into your soil block deeper or covered it if you're in trays, that you did it correctly. What would be your next point?
And then to look at your environment, and then you can also look and see, is it fresh seed? Did you buy a new seed this year, or is it old? And if you did buy it previously, was it stored properly? I mean, we see a lot of, like, for instance, seeds need to be kept cool and dry. And, I see seeds in the vegetable department of our local farm stand. They're outside in the heat, the whole display is. You know what I mean? It's like, where'd your seeds come from? Were they handled properly? Which most reputable seed companies do, right? Then how old is it? So there's all these things that I go down. And then if all those things check out, then it's like, all right, what was the temperature? Was it on heat? Did I forget to put a cookie cooling rack under it? I mean, stuff happens all day long like that. And the last case scenario, it's like, all right, let's try it over again. I mean, we restart stuff all the time around here. Stuff just happens, whether somebody didn't cover it or not, or covered it and it wasn't supposed to be. So that's what, before I start belly aching about something, usually we start it at least twice. And if we have 2 dead runs, depending on what it is, I may start it again, or I'll see if we have another variety of that and start it. And then that may result in a seed issue. But I will say that we rarely, if ever, see dud seeds.
This situation is also something that can commonly happen in the spring, when you might be starting your very first round of warm season seeds, and you'll notice nothing's sprouting, and it could just be that it's still a little too cool for them. And then you try it again a couple weeks later and everything comes up right from the same pack.
It's true. That is really, really true. And oftentimes that first sowing that you're speaking of, that first warm season, I specifically don't start some of the really pricey Celosia coxcombs for that very reason. It's like, we're pushing the envelope here, starting kind of early. We'll wait and put them on the next succession. So that's a great point.
Something else I would say to go back and check your seed packet for is this a seed that actually prefers to be direct sown outdoors?
Yes.
Maybe it prefers cooler temperatures or even temperature fluctuations that are just difficult for us to mimic in an indoor setting.
Yes.
So that's another thing, because that can be another common cause that it's not sprouting well for you indoors.
And I'm so surprised by how frequent that happens, Layne. I'm so glad that you brought that up. I even speak to growers, people that are starting seeds, and they're like, oh gosh, I just never plant. I'll tell you one that happen with is Orlea. And in fact, in the book Cool Flowers, I talk about starting Orlea inside, and we've totally changed our experience with them that we recommend direct sowing. But so many growers like, yeah, no, we don't even mess with Orlea anymore. We just can't get it to sprout indoors. And it's like, direct sow it and it'll be no problem. And you know what that indicates? It's really about cool temperatures. It needs a cooler temperature than most of us can provide indoors.
And then another thing too is there are some outlier seeds that actually prefer a cooler setup even than what we've just described as the typical setup. So I think of some things like maybe sweet peas, or like you mentioned, Ami or Daucus, and those actually might do better not even on the heat mat, or only on the heat mat for about 24 hours or so, like you mentioned before for the Ami and Daucus.
Yeah, I mean, there's not one size fits all. And obviously, I mean, I've been doing it for 27 years. I'm still learning new and better ways. You know, once somebody has great success and then they share it with others, then that's a better way to do it. So we'll never arrive. We're always on that journey.
And then I just have one more comment, because I have seen this happen to people before, especially when it's really small seeds and maybe you're sowing as we recommend and we do with a toothpick or something similar. If it's a small seed, make sure that it actually got deposited in your soil block, because really it sounds funny, but honestly, there are a lot of people, once I've pointed it out, they're like, oh, I did look at my toothpick as I brought it up and the seed was still on. So that is something that can actually happen.
Yes, that is really true. There's so many steps, and it just takes practice. You know, I mean, I've probably killed more seeds and seedlings in my career than most people have ever started because of the volume, right? And so that's why we've gotten so good at it, because we've done it over and over and over and over.
All right, our last question, and a very common one, is I always seem to experience poor germination on surface-sown seeds. Do you have any tips for these seeds in particular?
You know, I mean, it's all about keeping them moist. Would you not agree with that?
I would. I would say, for starters, make sure, like we just were talking about, make sure the seed is still firmly seated in that soil surface and getting good seed to soil contact. And then, like you just mentioned, go ahead about keeping them moist.
Yeah, and I mean, so I don't do this always, but I do keep a spray bottle in my grow room. And I'll tell you that I learned a secret from an organic lawn care guy years ago. I don't know if anybody remembers Paul Tukey. He had a home garden TV show. He was the lawn care guy, and he was an organic. This was way back, and I got to speak at a home and garden show that he spoke before me. So I got to talk to him afterwards. And he shared that their real secret weapon on getting great germination on grass seed was that after they prepare the lawn with compost and all kinds of stuff, do all kinds of things. But then he had developed an attachment for his mower or whatever little tractor he used that sprayed compost tea on the seed after they sowed it. And then I did speak to another gal who had an organic lawn care, and that was also her secret. So the moral to this story is to make compost tea to spray on your soil blocks could be a revolutionary thing. You have to have good quality compost, and you have to make tea. Tea doesn't last long. So it doesn't stay alive long. You have to use it all up. You can use it for a lot of things out in your garden. But I think that could aid in germination with these challenging seeds that are surface sown.
So I would definitely say, to number one, like we kind of have said for the other questions, to make sure that it actually is a surface sown seed. So that's for starters.
Yes.
If it is, make sure you really did or really do firmly seat them in the soil. Even though you're not going to be burying them or pushing them far down, they still need to be making good contact with the soil so they can imbibe that moisture and germinate successfully. And then we recommend using something, like we've said before, wide weave burlap or something similar over the surface until around 50% or so of the seeds show any signs of germination. And that just helps retain moisture at the soil surface. And then, like Lisa said, if you're still not having luck, try this misting technique she's talking about. And you can do it with just plain water, or better yet, something like compost tea.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we always say with surface sown seeds is, a lot of times, because the seed packs indicate the seed needs light to germinate, people will go ahead and right away think that they need to put them under grow lights.
Yeah.
And if your grow lights give off some heat, that can actually not only warm the seeds up, it can dry that surface out a bit too much. And that can also result in them not germinating as well. But in a typical room with some natural light, the ambient light in the room is generally sufficient even for seeds that say they need light to germinate.
Right. And speaking of that misting again, you can actually mist with the seaweed fish, but be warned, it's stinky.
Yes.
That's what makes me think the compost tea would really be a good alternative, because compost should not have an odor, right? So, keeping that surface moist, and you could just mist with a little bit of water. You don't have to have something, but that's a great point.
And the other thing I've done too is sometimes my growing space at this time of year just is too warm, and I'll notice that the blocks are drying out a bit too much. I will water twice a day if they are dry, just during that germination period until I start to see them cracking. So that's an option too that you might need to experiment with depending on your setup.
Yeah, and it is all about your setup, right? I mean, it's finding, perfecting your setup to make the best use of your time. I mean, if you're working and have kids, it's like you obviously really need to have a great setup that you only have to go in once a day. But if that's not your case and you can visit twice a day, that just might be the ticket.
All right, well, that was it for this episode on germination troubles that you might be experiencing with your cool flower transplants. Hopefully that helped answer some of the questions you might be having. And as always, feel free to use the form linked in the show notes to submit any other questions you might have, or you can leave a comment over on YouTube. And make sure to share Seed Talk with a friend if you are enjoying it. And as always, be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening so that you won't miss any of our future episodes.
Well, Layne, thanks for another timely episode. I know that I struggled with seed starting for years before I finally found soil blocking and then figured out my process. And I was not an overnight success. Well, I kind of did have a overnight success that really fueled me to get started, but it's not, you just have to do it over and over again. So I don't want anybody to be discouraged. And Cool Seeds and Hardy Annuals are kind of an awkward planting time. And so we just have to find that sweet spot for us. And I think it's really helpful for people to hear that lots of other people are having these same issues.
They are. And even when you've been doing it for so many years, you're still going to have situations where one tray of seeds just won't pop up or something. It happens to everyone, so don't beat yourself up too much about it.
Yes, that's for sure. So friends, remember, you can drop in over at thegardenersworkshop.com to find tools, seeds, supplies, our online courses. We have all the resources. So friends, we're here to help. And that's our mission. And we thank you for listening and telling a friend about the Seed Talk podcast.
Thank you.
Ciao, folks.
Bye.